Welcome to another Racer X Read Aloud, brought to you by Renthal. The undisputed global leader in manufacturing and design since 1969, Renthal has become notorious for a relentless obsession to detail and quality through their commitment to produce the finest products on the market today. With a history full of innovations in engineering and legendary component reliability, Renthal is universally regarded as the most trusted brand in the pro paddock and first choice to the world's premier athletes and race teams. With that, we'll throw it to Racer X Editor-in-Chief Davey Coombs and his story Finding Gene McCay, which you can find in the January 2021 issue of Racer X magazine. Enjoy!
Finding Gene McCay, tracking down one of the fastest kids ever to race a minicycle, one you may have never even heard of. The author is me, Davey Coombs. On an August afternoon in the summer of 2020, an older gentleman arrives at Loretta Lynn's ranch in the heart of Tennessee to see the first AMA Pro Motocross race ever held at the famous country singer's home. He has lived nearby his whole life, and while motocross played a huge part in his early years, he never actually raced at this mecca of youth and amateur motocross. Gene McCay's days on dirt bikes were long over before Loretta Lynn's motocross became a thing. McCay hails from nearby Lexington, and he's brought with him a tattered brown Samsonite suitcase he says will help illustrate his brief time as a motocross racer. His memory is fuzzy, which is understandable. It's been a while. But stored safely inside the suitcase are press clippings, event programs, posters, race results, and pictures that offer a snapshot of what motocross in Middle America was like in its nascent days of the 1970s. McCay, now 60, once gave this suitcase to his friend, Don Barber, for safekeeping. A good thing, because he lost everything else he owned in a flood. Now, other than what he still recalls, all that's left of one of the most celebrated and mysterious careers in minicycle racing is inside this old piece of luggage. As a lifelong enthusiast, I've long known the name Gene McCay. He was our sports version of a playground legend, known to beat some of the best blue-chip prospects in the game, only to disappear before he ever made it big. As a kid, he won several early AMA and NMA minicycle championships, which led my brother and me to become fans of his. We kept up with his career from our home in West Virginia in the pages of the newspapers and magazines of the day, including the old Minicycle Action magazine, no doubt inspired by the fact that he was from nearby Tennessee, not California, where most of the rest of the motocross world existed. We even saw him race once at the 1976 Kaiser's Ridge 125 National in Maryland, one of just 7 times he raced as a pro. Then Gene McCay disappeared from the results and the magazines. Even today, it's hard to find much about McCay's career online. A few years back, though, I mentioned him in a Racer X online list of the best minicycle racers of all time. It somehow got back to him, and he decided to come out to Loretta Lynn's for the first time. Unfortunately, I missed the chance to meet him. But then earlier this year, while working on a magazine feature about the pre-Loretta Lynn's Youth and Amateur Nationals, several of which he won, I started searching for him again online. I couldn't find Gene on Facebook, but I did find his sister Penny, and she in turn led me to Gene's close friend, Don Barber, who told me Gene was somewhat shy but did enjoy talking about the old motocross days, so he would give him a call. Together, they decided to come back out to the ranch with the old suitcase. Gene McCay begins by telling me he started riding and then racing when he was maybe 9 years old. His father, Daryl, a contractor and real estate developer, and his mother, Linda, got him into racing. His uncle, Delbert, and his grandfather, Ray, supported him too. Ray McCay once said about his grandson after a loss, quote, "He don't usually brag much about his racing. He'll get 'em next time. Wait and see. Like I always say about him and his motorcycle, if it don't quit or he don't fall, he'll get 'em every time." Unquote. By age 11, the boy was both the Tennessee and Arkansas state champion. The family started traveling to races further and further away: Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, Illinois, and more. They soon decided to go to their first national race, the 1972 NMA Winter Nationals, now known as the Mini-O's. And this is Gene McCay talking. Quote, "We took a Honda SL70, the one you put blinkers on, and headlights and all. We just put a number plate on it and went down to Jacksonville." Unquote. This is just as the game-changing Honda XR75 was coming out. The XR75 was a 72cc four-stroke single masterpiece, the first true minicycle race bike, which California's Jeff Ward would make famous as the first true factory minicycle racer. Mckay decided to stick with his old bike, which put out a whopping 6.5 horsepower. Gene says, "We ended up beating all of them new bikes on that SL70, forgetting to add that afterwards he was protested and torn down, but the bike was perfectly legal." Gene says, "That was maybe when people started to realize my potential." Unquote. Mckay's local legend grew so quickly that it aroused a little bit of jealousy in some of his older competitors. He remembers one race where he and his dad found that someone had hammered a nail into his back tire. He laughs about it now. People would do anything to win back then. In an August 73 profile in the mainstream Mid-South Sunday newspaper supplement, Mckay was featured on the cover as the Lord of the Bumblebees. He was 13 years old. The story said, Gene McCay, all 4 feet 10 and 90 pounds of him, sat dripping wet atop his motorcycle, dwarfed by the bearded 6-footer beside him, like a pint-sized Pony Express rider. Unquote. By this point, Mckay had switched to that Honda XR75 in the minicycle classes and a Kawasaki 100 against the adults. He also won a couple of AMA minicycle championships in the 60cc and 80cc classes by following a national tour the association created as a way to compete against the NMA. He was also an NMA champion. He won the 73 World Mini Grand Prix, beating all those fast Californians on their own turf. Mckay was soon being courted by off-brands like Steen and Chaparral, but he didn't like how they handled. In 1974, he was invited down to Atlanta by Dave Townsley to try one of the new Noguchi Yamaha 80s. Noguchi being a bolt-on, top-end engine and pipe mod kit that immediately made the Yamaha bike competitive. Noguchis were also white, which gave the bike a distinction similar to what Mugen would later do with a Honda CR125. Mckay would win the Winter Nationals again, topping Jeff Ward, whose family drove Jeff all the way across the country to race his Hondas. Says Mckay, "Me and Ward swapped out kind of like it is now with Eli Tomac or Ken Roxon. Sometimes he'd beat me, sometimes I'd beat him. I guess it kind of depended on what kind of tracks we were on, but we were usually right there with each other, and he was just a little itty-bitty guy." Unquote. Ward, a future legend in several sports, was of course then known as the Flying Freckle. Adds Mckay, "He would get that XR75 up on the back wheel and just go. We always had good races." Jeff Ward says, "Gene McCay was fast, no doubt about it, especially when he got on those Noguchi Yamahas. I was still on an XR75, which was really down on horsepower compared to two-stroke 80s. I should have been on a 150. Looking back, that's probably why 450s got to be double the size of two-stroke 250s." Unquote. After Mckay dominated much of the 74 AMA National Minicycle Series, he and Ward would meet again at the 74 NMA Championships at Rio Bravo in Texas, Mckay holding off the Honda Speedster until the very last lap when Ward went down. He also topped nationally known Texas hot shoe Sean Kelly, as well as Ozark, Arkansas's Audie Ward, no relation to Jeff. Next, the Mckays drove out to California for the 74 World Mini Grand Prix. Quote, "They had 13 identical Kawasaki 90s, number 1 through 13, lined up for us to do this Race of Champions on," Mckay remembers. Quote, "They had us draw out of a hat what bike we rode, and it was different for each of the 3 motos. Brian Myerscough was there. Flying Mike Brown, I think he won and I got second. Jeff Ward, yeah, I was right there." End quote. The 1975 season marked the first year of the AMA Amateur National Championships. The race was set up similarly to today, with a series of area and regional qualifiers leading to a final event. There were just 3 classes, 125, 250, and open, and the first final would be held in Baldwin, Kansas. By this point, Mckay, now 15, was racing a 125 Noguchi Yamaha. He was expected to win. He recalls, "That was the biggest amateur race ever to that point. It's like Loretta Lynn's is now." End quote. The event drew top young amateurs from all over the country, including Illinois, which is where McKay's other main rival lived. Mark Barnett was a prodigy in his own right. Like McKay, he won one of the first AMA Youth Minicycle titles in 1973, only he was still in the junior 80cc class, while McKay was in the expert classes. By 75, Barnett had become frighteningly fast on his red Honda CR125 Elsinore. In Kansas, he beat McKay in all three motos for the title. Barnett also beat California's Danny Magoo Chandler, who was there on his own Yamaha. Barnett recalls that day. I was just really good that day on that track, but I remember Gene being the only guy who was really up there with me in all three motos. He was really fast, and while that Noguchi Yamaha was a decent bike, he really made it work." End quote. As soon as McKay turned 16, he applied for his AMA Pro license. It was May of 1976, and his first 125 National would be Redbud. After he won his morning qualifier, the kid was suddenly out there with a bunch of future Hall of Famers, though just slightly older teenagers at the time. Marty Smith, Bob Hanna, Brock Glover, Danny Laporte, and Steve Wise among them. Barnett wasn't there. He was still an amateur at that point. McKay would finish a respectable 12th overall, a result that looks even more impressive when you see that Glover was 9th, Marty Smith 10th, Danny Laporte 11th. Says McKay with a smile, "I would finish 13th at the end of the year, but at least I was top privateer." End quote. But that 12th place debut would be his best pro finish ever. Quote, "Those other guys were all on factory bikes, and they were in shape. I was in decent shape, but not enough to go 40 minutes plus 2 laps twice. I mean, I could stay with them for 25, maybe 30 minutes, but then the last 15 or 20 minutes, shoot, man, they just pulled away. I wasn't into working out that much, not like I should have, or like they do now. I had to push my own self. I didn't have anybody to go with me. I mean, I just put on my tennis shoes and went on about a 5 to 7 mile run, and then I had a practice bike. Luckily, Yamaha gave me 2 bikes at the first of the year, one to race and one to practice on, and I would run a tank of gas through it, and that was about it. I wasn't in shape to be out there with a guy like Bob Hanna, but I was still a top privateer, so I felt like I'd done real good." End quote. McKay also remembers the exotic factory bikes of the year: Hanna's water-cooled OW27 Yamaha, Smith's Honda CR125M Type 2, Laporte's Suzuki RA125, being so much better than his own race bike, which often spent the night before the Nationals with him in the motel room. Says McKay, "That's when my bikes were getting real behind the other ones." End quote. He jokes that he was really only sponsored by Wheels Away Racing. Quote, "My dad would say, 'Boy, if you don't work harder and do better, I'm going to take your wheels away.' Those were the good old days." End quote. McKay entered just one AMA Supercross race in 1977 at the Houston Astrodome, but didn't make the main event. His last pro race was the 1977 Sandy Oaks 125 National in Illinois. He finished 17th overall. But later that same summer, Gene McCay, 18 years old, crashed heavily in a local outlaw race. He didn't really break anything, but he did sustain a concussion. That, combined with the financial challenges confronting his parents, led him to look at life's bigger picture. He says, "My dad and my mother, we was out of money. They were the ones really footing the bill when I was racing professional. We were just tired. We had been doing this since I was 9. We were at it every day for over half my life. I was 18, and I was really just burned out. We needed sponsors. I'd gone up as far as I could really go without factory help. It was hard to go all of those races all over the country, but yeah, we were right there." End quote. And with that, Gene McCay closes the suitcase. He stopped racing, going to work in construction instead, and later on a pipeline. But the Lord of the Bumblebees really was right there. So that's my story on Gene McCay, one of my childhood heroes who I never actually got to meet. When I did finally get to meet him, it was at Loretta Lynn's, and he and Don Barber had driven over, just as the story says, with a suitcase, and inside was just a lifetime of motocross memories. He said that, to that point when he quit, when he was 18, he'd been doing it half his life. And, you could tell that was a big part of his life. But Mckay, he was blown away seeing the 450s and the 250s and seeing the big rigs and just how much the sport had really evolved. Because when he quit in 1977, we were barely even in the box van days. People went to the races in vans and in trailers, and a race team consisted of a mechanic and a rider, and they rode together in the box van. It's come a long way, but for Gene, I think it was cathartic to come out. He also brought one of his early minicycle trophies, and the thing that really got me is it was the only trophy he really had left, having lost everything in that flood. And so when we had Loretta Lynn's 2, he came back again, and this time he brought his sister Penny and a few friends, and I think they really had a good time. It was a lot of fun to talk to people like Jeff Ward and Mark Barnett, and it's funny, was when I'd mention, did they remember Gene McCay? They both, immediately, went into a memory of how fast the guy was. And I have a feeling that had he been born somewhere else, maybe in California, maybe in Florida, maybe if he had a little more means, he might have ended up on that list of all those guys in the Hall of Fame that he had to race against day one. But I do think that level of competition, in hindsight, made him feel really good about the races he did win. It was a long time ago, any way you look at it. But I guess when we race motocross, it stays with us forever. And it certainly did with Gene McCay. And thank God he had that suitcase.